Yo! Video games.
What up, dudes? Matt here from YoVideogames with another Real Talk video. As anyone who's followed this channel or on my Twitch knows, I am a huge Xenoblade and the studio behind it, Monolithsoft fanboy. Considering the heavy preference for fighting games and action games from our community, there's probably more than a few of you who are probably wondering, why? Why Xenoblade in particular, and what makes it so special? Well, today I'm going to answer that question and why Xenoblade saved the JRPG genre for me upon its release 10 years ago. To be honest, my anticipation and hype for the game were much different back then. Monolithsoft at the time was in no way a favorite developer of mine. In fact, I had considered their biggest title at the time, Xenosaga, to be the ultimate culmination of everything wrong with gaming, especially for the genre. They had certainly made some pretty games like the Bite and Kaidos series, but they were really nothing special in my mind. In fact, when the game Monado was retitled as Xenoblade and announced for release around the same time as The Last Story in Japan by Final Fantasy vet Sakaguchi-san, I was much more excited for that game. I had played the Japanese release very briefly in its release year, but I was much more focused on The Last Story. A little over a year passed, and the European version of Xenoblade released, and upon returning back to it, and devoting a lot more time to it, I was hooked, and it dawned on me very quickly that Xenoblade was the game delivering on the expectation and promises I had almost forgotten for the genre. For most people growing up within the game industry in North America, it wasn't until the PlayStation that the JRPG genre became noticed. One thing that the JRPG genre had over other games at the time was length and the mindset that you were getting a lot more bang for your buck in an RPG versus most other games, which could be easily conquered in a weekend rental. Another factor was, of course, the much more in-depth storyline and characters as well as higher production values. As the PlayStation neared the end of its lifespan, Metal Gear Solid would change a lot of people's perceptions and taste in gaming. Cinematic cutscenes became the big thing, and RPGs already had lots of time devoted to their storytelling, so it really seemed like the natural conclusion to this line of thought. Square jumped right into it with Final Fantasy X with many voiced cutscenes, and Monolithsoft would jump even further in after leaving to join up with Namco and creating Xenosaga, which was far, far more movie than game. For myself, I was never on board with this idea. One of the best parts of an RPG for me was always getting access to the airship and then suddenly having the whole world of the game at your fingertips to explore. Strangely enough, it was Sega who really took this idea and ran with it for Skies of Arcadia, which devoted the whole setting of the game around airships. Speaking of which, where's my goddamn remaster, Sega? But getting back to the genre as a whole, once the PS2 hit, cinematic flair was all the rage, and the cost and time to develop such large-scale projects definitely became noticeable. While there were still many RPGs that came out on the PS2, it definitely seemed like the scope of them were a little more toned down in regards to large world maps, with lots and lots of side content to explore. Square, interestingly enough, would be one to somewhat defy this trend briefly with the long in development Final Fantasy XII. However, there are a few noticeable quirks with that game. It came extremely late in the life of the system, releasing weeks before the PS3 in North America. Also, it seemed Japan wasn't somewhat thrilled with the title, which is sort of reflected in its overall lower lifetime sales compared to Final Fantasy X, though that could be due to its release window more than anything. However, 12's rocky development would prove to be prophetic for Square Enix's mainline franchise going forward and to this day. Similarly, in Japan, Monolithsoft was also having its own problems. The Xenosaga series was, by their own admission, a disappointment sales-wise, and each subsequent sequel sold less than the previous entry, with Part 2 selling less than half of what they expected, and Part 3 only selling about 3/10 of the first game. Fucking ouch. Also, at this time, Namco and Bandai had completed a merger, and the feeling around the offices at Monolithsoft was not too rosy at the new management, with them citing that they were being given less creative freedom than what they had first signed up for. Enter fucking Nintendo of all goddamn companies. Nintendo had always notoriously shied away from most game projects that included mature themes and religious symbolism, all of which was basically what Monolithsoft was known specifically for. However, due to the Bite and Kaidos series, it seems a connection with the Big N was formed, and Namco would sell off its stake in the company over to Nintendo. The first few years under Nintendo were mostly recovery mode for the studio and its morale. They tried their hand at a different genre with Disaster Day of Crisis, and finished some license work for Namco with Super Robot Tyson and Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans. They also released a pretty original action RPG on the DS called Soma Bringer, that never released in the West, because at the time, Nintendo of America were kind of a bunch of fucks. While slowly building the studio morale up, founder Tetsuya Takahashi started brainstorming up an idea that would later become Xenoblade, though it would take a couple years to finally release the title. By 2010, the HD era was in full swing, and Square had just released their first HD Final Fantasy title in Japan. However, things were definitely amiss with the genre. The PS2 already saw a reduction in the amount of titles being made in the genre, but like many Japanese developers, the HD era would prove to be a huge hurdle, not only for the skyrocketing cost of development and time, but also for the fact that Japan as a whole was moving away from the console market entirely. While it was mostly a flash in the pan novelty in the West, the PSP was a monster success in Japan, and was having a fierce battle with the DS. This, in effect, made Japanese studios turn their attention to the portable market, as not only was their home territory more interested in it, but it was much cheaper to develop for. Nowhere is this more evident than with Dragon Quest IX going DS exclusive. Microsoft tried to get the jump on the genre early with the 360, as it was a clear sore spot for the first system. However, despite some really good efforts to gain exclusives, it never gained traction sales-wise. Enchanted Arms, Eternal Sonata, Tales of Vesperia, Blue Dragon, and Lost Odyssey were varying degrees of quality titles, but something that struck me about them was that they all seemed a little too familiar. There was a noticeable shift in the structure of the genre going from PS1 to PS2, and the 360 JRPGs felt like mostly the same as the previous generation with higher resolution and not much else. All eyes were looking towards Square, as they had the budget and team size to really push the envelope once again, as they did in the transition to the 3D era, and the result of their first multi-game project known as Fabula Novella Chrysalis was Final Fantasy XIII. Now, I know it certainly has its fans, but for myself and frankly many of the people around me, it felt like it was just about curtains for the once staple genre of console gaming. The scope had been pared so far back that to render all these HD graphics in Final Fantasy XIII, it was little more than a hallway simulator, and the developers even defended their decisions by stating that such things as towns would just take too long to make in HD. This was especially crushing for myself, as ever since Mario first started running around in 3D outside Peach's castle, my mind could never stop anticipating how much farther games could go. Rare doubled up on this with the amazing Banjo-Kazooie, and Ocarina of Time further helped cement how alive and in-depth the world could be. Let's not also forget the phenom of the PS2 era that was Grand Theft Auto 3 and its follow-ups, which only pushed the literal boundaries of game worlds further. And while I was never a fan of their ass-ugly designs, the Elder Scrolls games did always make you wonder what could be possible if somebody like Square had taken a concept like the big Western RPGs at the time and put an art style on it. But alas, it really seemed like the genre was in its death throes after Final Fantasy XIII, as far as major console releases go. Now, I understand this sounds like I'm saying there were no good RPGs during this time frame, but let me be clear. There were lots of good RPGs coming out at this time, and many of the aforementioned 360 exclusives were also pretty good, but it seemed like the era of reaching for the moon like with Final Fantasy VII was over, and most of the development was shifting to portable gaming because of its popularity in its home country. Enter the Monado. What importers and, let's be real here, a lot of pirates quickly discovered upon its release in Europe was how incredibly big and ambitious Xenoblade had turned out to be. There were huge quality of life improvements made for the genre, and more importantly, the world design. Despite being on the Wii, Xenoblade actually sought to match the size and scope of its Western counterparts. This was a double mind fuck for me, as not only was such a big, expansive JRPG that I'd always dreamed of not being released in America because NOA were a bunch of fucks, but it was coming from the last place on Earth I expected a JRPG that emphasized freedom and gameplay over cutscenes. The freaking developers of Xenosaga. That isn't to say it was a completely free-form, create a character, go wherever you want from the first hour kind of game. It was still very much a story-driven title, and technically still linear, but the size of each zone and the cleverness of their designs really helped push the game into the eyes of people around the world. While I don't have too much to add to its story, a campaign was launched to get Xenoblade Last Story and Pandora's Tower published in North America titled Operation Rainfall. It's hard to say what effect it eventually had on NOA, as they did decide to release a small print run online and only at GameStop in April the following year. And they also let Xseed release The Last Story and Pandora's Tower in North America. But what was more important was the legacy Xenoblade left. Afterwards, Monolithsoft would get right to work on making an engine for HD consoles, and a spin-off titled Xenoblade X was put into production. However, this time it would be a major part of Nintendo Directs going forward. The giant sprawling worlds made possible by Monolithsoft's team did not go unnoticed internally either, as both the engine for Xenoblade X and 60% of its staff were pulled into making the next major Zelda game, a small little release called Breath of the Wild. At the same time that was going on, the remaining staff pulled together to make Xenoblade 2, which would go on to be Monolithsoft's best-selling game ever. While the Xeno series may still not be anywhere close to Final Fantasy in terms of popularity and sales, the developers' work became crucial to Nintendo and were a huge reason why Breath of the Wild is the best-selling Zelda game by leaps and bounds. They took what people loved about massive worlds worth exploring and Western games and combined it with the art and storytelling stylings of Japan to create a company that now firmly sits at the forefront of people's minds when it comes to new JRPG releases. As a Nintendo E3 tagline once said, worlds worth exploring, and it seems nobody does it better than Monolithsoft. And that is one big reason for me why Xenoblade saved the genre. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you on the channel. Later, dudes.